November 6, 1993, 11:24 p.m., Kennesaw, Georgia. Under the sodium lights at the Barrett Parkway exit, Mark Ellison idled his Peterbilt, southbound on I-75, 8 miles short of downtown. Dispatch log, Cobb County, 2, Adam, 14, copy welfare check, I-75 southbound, mile marker 271. A clerk remembers exact change. A camera blinks once, then fails. Minutes later, the rig rolls out, taillights swallowed by the curve past the Wade Green Road overpass. What happened to Mark Ellison between 11:24 and 11:42 p.m., and why did his odometer freeze near the Highway 41 split? 20 years later, a drained quarry will answer, just not the way anyone expects. Something else was riding in that cab. He always said the road kept him honest. Mark liked the quiet window after the restaurants closed and before the bars spilled out, when the interstate settled into a low, breathing kind of noise. The truck was half his height again and twice his weight, yet it moved as if it knew his hands. He topped off diesel, wiped the windshield with a dirty squeegee, bought 1 black coffee and a ham biscuit, and told the clerk he'd be makin' by 2 if Atlanta behaves. The clerk nodded, uninterested, but noted the exact time because the register required it. Karen Ellison had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV murmuring. Their daughter, Nora, 9 and gap-toothed, had arranged her school photo under a magnet on the fridge so he'd see it before dawn. He always left a note when he ran late. Tonight there was no note. His last call, 11:07 p.m., "Don't wait up," was casual enough to convince Karen that the weather and the wait would decide whether he made it home before sunup. It was the kind of reassurance that doesn't ring as warning until it's too late to hear the tone. The interstate at that hour was a river of reflected signs and reflective tape. He merged into the slow lane and let the big engine hum. The radio burped routine traffic. A blown tire near Delk Road, a stalled sedan straddling the shoulder at MM 270, a domestic call in Marietta that didn't concern a trucker with an early delivery. Then a familiar name slid across the CB like a coin across a counter. "Keller, you copy?" Brian Keller, his partner, and the other half of the business stenciled on the door. The voice sounded level, maybe too level, the way men sound when everything is not fine and they need you to say it is. Mark didn't answer on the CB. He never liked discussing money with a microphone open. He flashed the hazards, took the next exit and looped back to the service road that paralleled the interstate, the place local drivers used to cut around the worst of the traffic. A second set of headlights settled in his mirrors and held steady. The clock on the dash clicked to 11:34. He set his coffee in the holder, tapped the brakes to test the load, and told himself that friends deserve the courtesy of a conversation, even if that conversation starts in a parking lot and ends in a favor you don't want to grant. Years later, people would say the signs were there. A good man grows quiet when he's already decided to do the difficult thing. A careful man checks mirrors more than usual. A loyal man turns the wheel anyway. He took a right at the spur road that used to feed the quarry trucks and now fed no one, just a ribbon of cracked asphalt that disappeared behind kudzu. He was not lost. He knew exactly where he was. He just didn't know who else had learned that road's usefulness. At 12:03 a.m., dispatch logged, 2, Adam, 14 clear from welfare check, no contact at MM 271, vehicle gone on arrival. The kind of entry that later reads like a shrug but that night felt like a dozen others in a county that never sleeps. A state trooper rolled on, blinked at an empty shoulder, and merged back into the slow lane. In the absence of a problem, the record kept moving, indifferent and complete. Karen woke at 3:11 a.m. to the quiet that only arrives when the thing you're listening for has failed to show. She checked the driveway twice. She called Mark's pager, then his work line, then their neighbor Jared, Mark's younger brother, who said he'd check the route in the morning. Dawn made everything look solvable for about 10 minutes. By noon, the dispatcher had filed a missing person report and the company's insurance had opened a claim. The gossip machine started before the first flyer went to the print shop. Someone always knows a friend of a friend with a theory, and theories multiply best in daylight. Nora kept her school photo where she knew he'd see it when he came home. She put a glass of water next to it, then moved it away because the ring it left on the counter looked like a stain she could never scrub out. Children don't have the vocabulary for a vanishing. They do, however, know how to measure a silence. That afternoon she measured it in commercials and the spaces between weather updates, in the way her mother held the phone like it might argue back. By the end of the week, drivers on the Atlanta Loop had turned Mark into a cautionary tale. He was the man who missed an exit and found a hole. He was the man who ran, the man who fell asleep, the man who owed, the man who didn't. The stories contradicted each other and still managed to point in the same direction, away from the part where someone who knew him had made a decision too heavy to lift. Officially, there was nothing to hold. Unofficially, there was a list of places to drag. The water at Bellwood Quarry looked black at night and green at noon. People said it had no bottom. People say that about any water that has taken something they weren't ready to lose. 20 years will pass before the city pumps it down and a shape appears where only rumor used to live. By then, the clerk will have new cameras, the radio codes will have changed, and a daughter will be old enough to take a call that breaks and repairs the same heart in a single breath. But on this night, at 11:42 p.m., the rig cleared the service road and slipped out of the camera's blind corner like a coin falling through fingers. You can't see the driver. You can see the choice. Someone else was watching him choose. Nora Ellison almost let the call go to voicemail. It came in on a gray Thursday, 20 years after her father's last run, while she was hunched over a wall of paint chips at a hardware store off Howell Mill. The number was local, the voice steady. Sheriff Reed Mallory asked if she could sit down. She told him she was fine where she was, then watched a fan of color cards slip from her hands and skate across the floor like fallen leaves. He said they had found a Peterbilt at Bellwood Quarry, 30 feet down in water that had preserved more than it should have. He said the VIN matched. He said a wallet had survived. He said a name. Mark Ellison. Her mouth said that couldn't be possible. Her chest knew it already was. The county building smelled like disinfectant and old paper. The medical examiner was younger than Nora expected, her tone careful, her words sanded smooth by practice. Mark's face was not what time usually does. Water without air makes different bargains. Leathered skin, the outline of a mustache she remembered from every childhood photo, the nick on his chin from a loading dock mishap. Nora's hand found the rail of steel, cold and clean. Karen stood beside her in her hospital scrubs, older now, posture braced as if grief could be lifted with the right form. The examiner said a small injury to the back of the head suggested a firearm. She did not linger on caliber. She did not linger on angles. She presented a bag with a receipt that years and water had somehow laminated. Barrett Parkway exit. November 6th, 11:42 p.m. 2 coffees. 2 biscuits. Paid cash. Nora said her father never bought 2 of anything at that hour. The room learned the sentence and placed it carefully on the table. At the impound lot behind the sheriff's office, the truck still sweated quarry water from its undercarriage. Algae clung where chrome used to win the argument. Sheriff Mallory swung the door and the cab exhaled air that had been trapped with proof. On the dash, under a faded sleeve of plastic, an 8x10 school photo grinned with missing teeth. Nora remembered placing it there, proud as if she had invented paper. The sleeping compartment held exactly what a 3-day run requires. Change of clothes, travel soap, a paperback with a creased spine. One thing was missing. Mark's logbook, the one he wrote in with a square, careful hand as if numbers could be convinced to behave. The absence made more noise than the items that remained. Mallory had brought evidence bags. He'd been a young deputy when Mark vanished, the guy who ran to get coffee for the senior investigator and stayed late to write reports no one would remember. He was softer around the middle now, harder around the eyes. He reached under the passenger seat and came up with a second receipt, the corner welded to the floor mat by fine silt. Same night. Same location. 9:58 p.m. 1 coffee. 1 biscuit. Paid credit. Name on the strip, Brian Keller. Nora stared at it until the letters became shapes and then became letters again. Brian had come to Thanksgiving after Mark disappeared. Brian had shown up with forms, with advice, with checks from the insurer that paid the mortgage and her freshman tuition. Brian had also sold the company for what he called a clean exit. He had been a constant, which was its own kind of camouflage. Mallory didn't push a theory. He let the receipt sit between them like a coin on a bar. He asked when Nora had last seen Brian. She said 5 months ago, at a wedding where he'd told her Mark would have approved of the vows. She remembered the way he smiled at the word approved, as if it meant something only he and her father understood. She remembered how he left early, citing a headache that didn't match the way he looked at the dance floor. She remembered a dozen other small noticings, unhelpful at the time, suddenly magnetic now. Back at the hardware store, the manager had put Nora on leave with pay. Family first, he said, meaning well and saying more than he knew. Karen kept her daughter moving. Motion is a good solvent in the first hours. They made a list. Call Jared. Call the insurance adjuster whose number lived in a file no one had opened in years. Find the attorney who handled the original claim. Stare down the rumor that had been kind enough to die when Mark did not come home, then resurrected itself in the faces of people who weren't sure what to say. That night, Nora opened a shoebox she hadn't touched since high school. Inside were letters Mark had mailed from the road, written from rest areas and loading bays, each one describing weather as if reporting from the edge of a country only he could see. She looked for a clue and found a father. She didn't cry. Not yet. She sorted every page into neat stacks, then took out the school photo from the dash and set it beside them, passed and proof breathing the same air again. The quiet between a discovery and an explanation is a thin place. You can hear your own heartbeat there. You can also hear footsteps. Mallory called just after midnight. They had pulled registration records from the convenience store's ancient system. The clerk now had digital cameras and better coffee. In 1993, they had a coupon book and a tape that recorded over itself every 24 hours. Still, something remained. A credit authorization for Brian's card at 9:58. A cash purchase at 11:42. A gap with room for an argument. A service road with room for a second vehicle. A quarry road that was never really abandoned, only ignored. Mallory said he needed Nora at the station in the morning. She asked if Brian was coming in. He said Brian had already called his lawyer. If you've ever watched a door you love begin to unlock from the wrong side, you know the feeling. Whose hand is on the key and why now? The search warrant on Brian Keller's tutor in Smyrna felt strangely polite. Morning light on an ironed lawn, a bronze eagle on the mailbox, a wreath that announced seasons like they couldn't change without permission. Brian hovered with his attorney in the foyer, reading glasses parked on his head, a man rehearsing surprise and landing on irritation. Sheriff Reed Mallory kept it quiet, methodical, opening drawers the way he opened old case files. Flat palms, no theatrics. In the office, behind binders of tax prep and a picture of Brian shaking hands at a chamber breakfast, a small safe gave up a ring of keys and a folded lease. Westside Self-Storage, Unit 319, paid in cash since January 1994. The attorney tried the word harassment. Mallory tried the word preservation and signed the chain of custody line without looking up. Unit 319 breathed conditioned air and the smell of corrugated time. Bankers' boxes stood in rows, black marker dates on the spines like a homemade archive. November 1993 sat eye level, unlabeled lid askew. Inside, manila folders, a plastic pouch of fuel receipts, and at the bottom, a clear cassette case, microcassette size, with a piece of masking tape labeled in square, careful letters, ME116 cab. Mallory said they'd play it at the lab. Nora asked to hear it once, here, before the room told them how to feel. He nodded. An evidence tech clicked a battered recorder on. Static, engine noise, the clack of a turn signal wearing a groove in silence. Then Mark's voice, flattened by tape and time but unmistakable in its tempo. 2300. Load finally squared. Keller says he needs to talk. He's behind me on 75. Wants me to pull off at Barrett. Says it's about the business. The sound of a coffee lid snapping on. A laugh with no humor in it. He's got Marino's name in his mouth again. Brian's voice arrived like a man leaning through a doorway he'd used too often. Slurred only by stress, not drink. Just drive, Mark. We can talk on the move. A shuffle, the passenger door seal breathing. It's temporary paperwork. You know how these cycles go. We move some money around, put the company as beneficiary just for a month, then switch it back. It's nothing. Mark exhaled, The kind of sound you make when you've already decided your answer. You're asking me to sign my family over to your debt. A click, the turn signal slowing. We'll talk at the office tomorrow. Not here. Brian pushed. He had a salesman's rhythm even when he was pleading. Vince Marino doesn't do payment plans. He sent a guy to my house. He knows where Karen works. He knows Nora's school schedule, Mark. The name landed heavy in the cab, a terrible intimacy, the way fear shortens distances. Paper rustled. Just sign. Cover me for 30 days, I'll square it, and we go back to boring. I'm begging. Then stop gambling. Mark's voice sharpened. Sell the boat. Sell the lake lot. Tell Dolores you lost. Grow up. The tape caught the truck turning, tires crunching through gravel, the engine throttling down. Old Quarry Road, Mark said, almost to himself. Why here? So we don't block the shoulder, Brian answered too quickly. So we can talk without a state trooper asking questions. The sound of doors opening. Night sounds stepped in, crickets, far-off traffic, a hush that felt like a held breath. Brian again, closer, steadier. Marino says if you won't help, we make it look like you ran. Insurance pays either way. I don't want that. Help me. Sign. Mark's tone didn't spike, it settled. He was a man who knew what he could live with. No. Call the bank. Call a lawyer. Call the police. Don't call me about this again. There are sounds a microphone can't dignify with full names. A small metallic suggestion, a hard intake of Mark's breath, a hiss of air as if a match was struck in a windbreak. Then a sharp, flat crack, too neat to be anything but what it was. The recorder jolted against plastic. Someone whispered a curse 3 times, quieter each time. Grunting, dragging, the cab door thumping open, the engine fired. The tape murmured speed and distance for 10 long seconds, then went blank, mechanical silence that felt intentional, not accidental, like a hand had found the stop button because some part of the man holding it knew how a story ends. The tech clicked the device off. The storage unit made living sounds. HVAC hum, cardboard shift, Nora's breath calibrating to a present that had rearranged itself. The boxes were suddenly too square, the fluorescent lights too clean. Sheriff Mallory didn't fill the quiet with explanation. He let the tape sit between them, the way he had let the receipt sit, the way he had let the truck breathe quarry air onto his boots. He said they would authenticate, match the voice to other recordings, track the unit's rental with bank withdrawals, and subpoena Brian's phone records. Nora nodded because her mouth wasn't ready to trust words. On the drive back to the station, she watched Atlanta's skyline break through the windshield like teeth. She thought of Brian at Thanksgiving, telling a joke about overcooked turkey, cutting Karen a slice of pie like he'd been born into their kitchen. She thought of the way he shook Jared's hand at the funeral everyone attended even though there had been no body. The kindness had edges now. That's how camouflage works. It borrows the shape of a thing you once loved and waits for you to look away. Mallory's phone pinged with a response from a trooper he'd asked to scrape old toll data. In 1993, Georgia didn't have full electronic tolling on that stretch, but Brian's SunPass from trips to Florida had registered at a private truck scale near Marietta that used an early tag reader for fleet discounts. The timestamp, 10:12 p.m., northbound, then 10:49 p.m., southbound. It put him in the orbit he denied, with minutes to spare and a reason to hurry. The attorney called before they reached the station. Brian would not be coming in, he would be available by appointment only. Mallory said okay and hung up. He didn't sound disappointed. He sounded like a man who had expected this and was already moving the next piece. He told Nora something he hadn't told her yet. There was another name in Brian's files, and it wasn't Marino. It belonged to the man who'd once owned half the rock in this city. The quarry kept more than water. It kept introductions. The name in Brian's files sat on the page with the calm of a signature that had never been challenged. Harold Monroe. The man whose foundation sponsored school libraries. The voice that cut ribbons on projects Atlanta bragged about in glossy brochures. The quarry that swallowed Mark's truck had belonged to his holding company for just long enough and then not at all, like a magician palming a coin. Mallory traced deeds and transfers on a conference room wall, stringing arrows from Monroe Development to a shell called Monroe Rock to a brief stopover at a paper LLC and finally, for a dozen months in 1993, to Marino Construction. It wasn't unusual, he said, for properties to move between partners in a big civil project. It was unusual for one of those partners to receive consulting fees from a two-truck freight company days after a man disappeared. The payment sat in Ellison and Keller's ledger like a thumbprint. $18,500, paid November 12th, memo, route optimization. Nora stared at the words until they lost meaning. Route optimization is when you avoid rush hour. It isn't when you discover the shortest distance between a living man and a body of water. She asked how a company bleeding cash after Mark's absence could afford generosity. Mallory answered by sliding over a photocopy of a cashier's check made out by Brian 3 days before. Cash withdrawn from a loan that should never have been approved, deposited into an account Marino used for equipment rental, then routed back through a consulting invoice to make the circle look like a line. It was clumsy, like men who think they've learned the rules inventing a new game in a hurry. They needed more than paper. Paper proves structure. Voices prove intent. That's when the woman from the quarry walked into the station wearing a safety vest that had seen every season. She introduced herself as Ana Morales, a warehouse lead who had worked the Monroe yards on and off since her 20s. She took off a glove and set a cheap USB recorder on the table like it was some fragile insect. "I didn't know where else to take this," she said. "I've been recording things I thought sounded wrong. You collect enough wrong and it starts to sound like a plan." Anna's audio was grainy and patient. Forklift beeps in the background, men talking in the compressed voices of people who think a door and a low tone make them invisible. A supervisor ran through a delivery that had twin manifests, one for the city, one for the people who actually counted weight. And then a line that fanned across every hair on Nora's arms, "Bellwood's deep. You drop something there, no one finds it unless they empty the sky." No names, but the habits of the powerful tend to wind their own clockwork. When Anna named a calendar entry she'd seen on a manager's desk, Monroe plus Marino, quarterly, the gears began to mesh. Jared brought another piece Nora didn't know he had. A manila envelope from a box in his garage marked Brian. He had taken it from the office the week Brian sold the company because it felt like a small rebellion, he said, like saving a spoon from a house that was being robbed. Inside was a Polaroid, the kind of night shot that turns everything into fog and reflection. In the corner, the flare of taillights near dark water. On the back, in a blunt hand, Luke Keller, 11 out of 6, Marietta, assist. Jared went pale holding it. Luke Keller had been Brian's older brother, dead since 2004. He wasn't on anyone's suspect list because Luke hadn't been in town by the time the rumors hardened. But the photo didn't care about rumor. Mallory took the pieces to the district attorney, a woman who had watched men like Monroe raise glasses at donor dinners for a decade and learned to ask questions no one wanted on the program. Rachel Pierce had a prosecutor's calm and a runner's clipped energy, a way of standing that suggested she'd go through a wall if the door stuck. She flipped the ledger, listened to Anna's recordings, examined the property transfers, and made a decision like she was tightening a bolt. She drafted a material witness order for Brian and a subpoena for Monroe Development's internal emails from 1993, which now lived in an off-site backup after someone, accidentally, purged the local drive last week. She requested bank records for Marino Construction, expecting more consulting fees that mirrored the first. Then she asked to see the microcassette again. "Juries don't forgive coincidence if the coincidences fit like teeth," Rachel said. "But they love an admission, even a sideways one." She looked at Nora. "Can you handle hearing it in court?" Nora thought about her father's voice coming through a box that fit in her palm. She thought about the way the tape hiccuped before the sound cut off. She thought about Brian saying her name in a whisper meant for pressure, not comfort. She nodded. "Then we proceed." They hit resistance the way anyone hits a power grid they can't see. Monroe's counsel filed to quash, citing charity boards and civic leadership as if good works repelled warrants. Marino's office sent polite replies that carried no information. Brian's attorney offered to produce his client after the holiday, like absence could be calendared into innocence. Mallory scheduled a pre-dawn pickup instead. Nora didn't sleep. She walked her apartment and put post-it notes on things that were true: the school photo from the dash, the letter Mark had mailed from a rest stop the summer before he vanished, the truck stop receipt with impossible totals, the microcassette that held the night between breaths. At 5 a.m., Mallory texted a single sentence: "Search team rolling on Monroe property." 15 minutes later, a second line came through: "You should see this." The impound lot was quiet enough to hear the drip from Mark's axles. Nora climbed into the sleeper with a small screwdriver from Mallory's pocket, the cab smelling like wet metal and old exhaust. Her father had taught her once, on a 4th of July when the world still felt permanent, that the ceiling panels came down if you knew where to press. She felt for the notch, found the give, and eased a square of vinyl free. Insulation sagged. Behind it, a plastic bag wrapped in duct tape knocked against her knuckles. She didn't breathe until she'd lowered it to the seat. Inside were two things that didn't belong to any company: a spiral notebook in Mark's precise hand and a microcassette labeled 11/5 statement. The notebook was a ledger of days, more honest than the official logs. He had dated pages with terse courage. Keller, late again, covered fuel. Marino in the office. Meeting set by Monroe's secretary. He wrote like time might notice if he softened it. On the last page before November 6th, a line that made the room lean: "If I don't make it back, tell Nora I didn't volunteer to leave her." They played the tape in Mallory's office with the door shut. Mark's voice came through steady, as if he'd rehearsed it alone in a parked truck. He stated his name, the date, the routes he'd driven, the companies he suspected were using small carriers to move things that didn't belong on invoices. He said Brian owed money to Marino. He said Monroe's people were measuring me for something after he refused to sign a stack of forms that would make Ellison and Keller the beneficiary on his life insurance for 30 days. He asked whoever heard this to check Brian's purchases for a .22 that October and to look in safe deposit 319 at First Citizens, because that's where the backup lived. He didn't ask for sympathy. He asked for sequence. If this recording is found and I am not, my family did not get to choose that. Rachel Pierce signed the bank order herself. The manager at First Citizens looked as if he'd swallowed a pebble when the number matched. Box 319 was heavier than it looked. Inside were plastic sleeves of photographs, Polaroids of yards and manifests, copies of checks that made sloppy circles between accounts, and Mark's pocket ledger of off-the-books observations written in a hand that never shook. There was also an envelope addressed to Nora, his script smaller than usual as if shrinking would make it easier to carry. She opened it standing up. He apologized without apology. He said he had two choices and both were bad. He said if he ran, others would be hurt in his place. He said he believed in two things that never change their minds: his daughter's face and the way proof behaves when it's kept safe. The call came while they were cataloging. A man introduced himself as Special Agent Daniel Deacon, Dallas Field Office, assigned to coordinate interstate aspects of the quarry find. His voice was dry and clipped, the way authority can be when it thinks it's on the side of the ledger with the seal. He asked Nora to bring the originals directly to him that afternoon. He said the local office wasn't set up to secure historic evidence overnight. No one invites a civilian to deliver evidence to Dallas. Rachel muted her phone and scribbled a note: "Stall, trace." Deacon continued, a degree more personal. "It would be safer for your mother if we handle this cleanly. We understand people get nervous and misplace items. You don't want that. Threats have fingerprints." Mallory's face didn't change much, but Nora saw his jaw set. Rachel nodded once. They built a plan like mechanics rebuilding a brake line. No wasted motion, check every connection twice. Box 319 went to the evidence room. Copies went into a plain briefcase. Nora wore a recorder beneath a denim jacket and carried the letter from her father in her pocket like a talisman and a dare. If the man on the phone was who he said, they would meet and hand him the law. If he wasn't, the law would be waiting where he didn't look. They chose a city garage under the federal building, the kind of concrete that eats sound and light. Rachel took a position by a pillar with two agents she trusted from another circuit, Men who owed her favors and didn't drink with the usual crowd. Mallory waited half a block away with a warrant that only needed a name filled in. Deacon arrived in a black SUV with temporary plates, 2 suits with him and no badges on display. He was younger than his voice and too smooth for a man who spends his days in paperwork. He shook Nora's hand and asked if she had what they discussed. She asked for his ID. He showed a leather wallet with an eagle and an embossed card that would survive a 3-second glance. She took 4. "Do we have a problem?" he said, smiling the way men smile at locked doors. "No," Rachel said from the pillar, stepping into view with her badge low and her voice high enough to carry, "We have a recording and a judge." The agents with her were already moving. Deacon reached toward his jacket and went still when a pistol shouted no from 10 feet away. He was cuffed by people he had probably seen at conferences. He said there was a misunderstanding. He said this would embarrass everyone. He stopped saying anything when Mallory walked up with the microcassette in a bag and called him by his first and last name, neither of which belonged to an agent. Nora stood there and let adrenaline taper, the concrete finally breathing again. The letter in her pocket felt warmer than paper should. Rachel told her what every good prosecutor tells a witness when the first domino falls. "We didn't just remove a man, we knocked out a line." At the station, after statements and signatures and the relief that followed the careful kind of fear, Mallory told Nora there were 2 more doors this arrest would open. The first led to Marino. The second led straight to Harold Monroe. The first message came from a number no one owned. "Meet me at the old I-20 rest area at midnight. I can tell you why Mark never came home." Nora let the text sit until her pulse slowed, then forwarded it to Sheriff Reed Mallory and Rachel Pierce with one word, "Bait?" Rachel replied with a time and a list. "Leave your phone on, park nose out, don't be a hero." Mallory added the thing only a cop who has buried cases says. "If this is real, it wants something from you. If it isn't, it wants everything." Midnight on an abandoned pull-off has a particular silence. The highway roars 100 yards away, but the pavement under your feet keeps its own counsel. A dented Crown Vic waited under a dead light. The man inside looked like a rumor holding itself together, thin, gray, oxygen tank whispering. He introduced himself as Frank Delgado, once a helper for Vince Marino, now a patient racing a clock. He said he'd carried cash and messages and fear for years, and that he owed a debt to a man who said no. "I gave Brian the quarry road," Frank said, hands trembling but voice cool. "He needed a place nobody checked. I told him it was just for a talk. When he came back, his shirt had a stain he wouldn't look at." He slid a padded mailer across the seat. Inside were photocopies of payments, Marino construction to Monroe development and back again, labeled consultation and site prep like language could launder intent. In the corner of one note, a name, Keller, Cyst. Luke again, a ghost tying knots. Headlights sliced the dark, 3 cars sweeping in at angles that turned the lot into a triangle you couldn't leave. A tall man stepped from the middle sedan with the unhurried posture of someone who owns the next minute. Harold Monroe's suit looked like a decision. He smiled as if catching up with a friend in a grocery line. "Ms. Ellison," he said, "late nights don't suit the anxious." He gestured toward Frank. "You were supposed to be in hospice." Frank coughed, the sound of a bad engine refusing to quit. Nora felt the small recorder under her jacket press into bone. She counted the men, 3 with Monroe, 1 still in the driver's seat, 1 by the rear bumper pretending not to watch. "You're interfering with a witness," she said, because saying the obvious out loud can change who hears it. Monroe glanced at her hands like he was measuring risk, then shrugged. "Witnesses are stories with lungs," he said. "Stories can be edited." Frank moved first. He didn't aim to kill, he aimed to scatter. 2 cracks into the air and the men flinched, the way trained bodies always do when training meets a complication. "Run," he told Nora, and it was the tone fathers use when the kitchen is on fire and the door is closer for a child than a parent. She ran. Gravel skated. The treeline took her, swallowed her, gave her enough cover to call Mallory with a location and the word now. She didn't run home. She ran north, through scrub toward the black oval of Bellwood, because the city has only so many places where proof and power intersect. Under moonlight, The water looked like slate. A pickup she knew sat near the gate. Jared climbed out, Mark's younger brother, wearing the grief-squared look of men who have had to say the same name at 2 funerals. "Monroe called me," he said. "Said he'd trade you for papers he thinks you have." He swallowed. "He has Tyler." Nora's stomach went cold. Her cousin, 20, a kid who still called Mark uncle, like time didn't move. Monroe stepped from the shadows with 2 men and the relief of a plan he liked. "Family values," he said, slowing his steps the way people do when they want a scene to memorize itself. "Bring me what's mine," and the boy goes home with all his fingers. Jared held an old .22 in both hands like a prayer. His voice didn't shake. "You don't get to talk about home." Monroe lifted his palm, bored with theater. "You won't shoot," he said, and took 1 step too close. The report was small, a hard pop that sounded like a knuckle in winter. Monroe flinched and went down on 1 knee, hand at his shoulder, suit darkening. Not fatal. Not intended to be. Enough to end the idea that he couldn't be touched. Sirens rose, a layered sound, county and state, and a rhythm Rachel had ordered. The men with Monroe faltered. People trained to move toward power don't move well when it bleeds. Mallory's cruiser led the pack through the gate. Rachel came on foot, hair pulled back, voice carrying certified instructions. "Hands where I can see them. Drop it." A medic pressed gauze to Monroe's suit as cuffs found wrists. In the back seat of a sedan 2 rows over, Tyler raised his head, eyes wide, hands bound with zip ties that snapped under a deputy's pocket knife. He said he was okay, like young men say it when they've learned what not being okay can cost. Monroe's SUV, left idling, held boxes a careful man should never carry. Cassettes in labeled cases, contracts with notes in the margins, a journal with dates that matched Nora's father's ledger. 1 tape had black marker across its spine, Emmy November 1st, office. They played 30 seconds on scene to make sure it was what the label promised. Mark's voice, unbending and tired, asking Monroe why he wanted Ellison's to wear someone else's debt. Monroe, younger and sharper, replying that some rivers run one way and men either learn to swim with them or they sink. Rachel stopped the tape before it finished. "Chain it," she said. "We do this in a room." By morning, Brian Keller was dead in the jail infirmary, a sheet looped, a story assembled too fast. Mallory's face went hard in the kind of quiet that moves paperwork at speed. Deacon's burner phones began to ring names out of banks and boards like loose stucco off a bad wall. Rachel filed motions with the urgency of someone who knows recoil follows every strike. Nora sat with Karen in a waiting room that smelled like lemon and fear and held her father's letter like a compass. The city outside went about its Friday, unaware that 1 small shot had unspooled a long, hidden rope. An hour later, a text arrived from another new number with a sentence that didn't fit the calendar. "Check the quarry records from 1977 to 1992. Someone else used Bellwood before Harold ever did." The records office kept its bones in cardboard. Nora stood with Rachel Pierce and Sheriff Reed Mallory while a clerk named Brenda slid gray boxes across a metal counter and warned them about dust. Deeds, leases, liens, Bellwood Quarry had a paper life long before developers learned to say, "park." The first surprise came in a notarized transfer from 1977, 2 years before the quarry ceased operations. Title moved to a company called Piedmont Extraction, then to a shell with a P.O. box and a misspelled street name, then to a holding firm no one had spoken aloud in 20 years, Kestrel Aggregate. It wasn't Monroe's. It wasn't Marino's. It predated both. Brenda tapped a fingertip on a signature. "You know this name?" she asked. A younger assistant district attorney once. Now a judge who'd blocked search warrants Rachel had written 3 times in the past decade. The quarry had friends older than the rumor of its depth. Ana Morales had been right about wrong things accumulating into a plan. A second set of boxes held accident reports that were never posted publicly, missing persons who were never tied to water, and payment logs from a concrete supplier that billed night pour surcharges to Kestrel on dates that matched the disappearances. Rachel's jaw tightened, that small, private anger of a public servant realizing the game started before she was born. "They were practicing here," she said quietly, as if naming it kept it from growing. "Monroe didn't invent the trick. He inherited it. Frank Delgado, bandaged and stubborn, gave a sworn statement from a hospital bed and died 2 days later. He identified 2 men from the old Kestrel days, one long dead, one living in a lakeside condo under his 3rd last name. The living one, when picked up, gave a confession like a man bumping into furniture in the dark. He described Bellwood as an insurance policy, a place where problems were buried under city plans, where the absence of oxygen did as much work as any accomplice. He said he'd heard of a truck in 1993, a friend of a friend job, a favor extended to a businessman who never liked to carry his own dirt. The businessman's name belonged to Harold Monroe. The word favor traveled like a thread through time and tied a circle. Rachel didn't smile. Winds that come late carry the weight of all the years they didn't. The city pumped Bellwood to construction levels again. Divers found 2 vehicles no one knew to miss, each with a story that had been filed as something else. They found nothing of Mark beyond what they already had, and that was a mercy. Karen brought fresh flowers to a new stone that finally had a date on both sides. Jared came with Tyler and stood a step back, hands in his pockets, a young man who had discovered that fear's worst trick is teaching him to be smaller than he is. Nora slid her father's letter back into its envelope after reading it once more under a sky that smelled like rain. Vince Marino flipped first. Faced with Deacon's arrest and a ledger that drew a map even he could follow, he traded the rest of his life for words in a courtroom. He admitted to fronting Brian Keller's debt, to making noise about the Ellisons, to suggesting Bellwood because it had a reputation among men who manage problems. He had receipts that pointed to consulting fees that weren't consulting, and emails that treated properties like chessboards and people like pieces you clear when the game is crowded. He said Monroe liked the quarry because it gave him distance without dirt on his shoes. He said it like he was telling them about weather. Brian Keller didn't get to flip. His death in the infirmary didn't make sense to anyone who worked there more than a week. An internal camera, the one that should have looked directly at his door, had been conveniently under maintenance. Mallory's rage arrived dressed as paperwork, and he followed the paper until a jail contractor lost a job and a federal task force gained a suspect. It didn't bring Brian back. It did put a hole in the idea that the old favor network could still whisper its way into quiet endings. Monroe went to trial with cufflinks and a haircut that pretended the last year hadn't happened. He listened to Mark's tape with a courtroom full of people who had grocery lists and rent checks and some private grief of their own but paused anyway to hear a dead man say no. He did not look at Nora when Rachel played the 30 seconds from the office tape, the part where Mark refused a signature and Monroe offered a river to drown in. A jury did what juries sometimes do when given proof that fits like teeth. The verdict landed without ceremony. Life, plus the kind of math that takes away the arrogance of counting. Nora packed her apartment in quiet layers, saving last the things that hummed when she touched them. The school photo from the dash, the microcassette, the screwdriver that had pried open a ceiling and a history. Anna came by with coffee and a hug that lasted 1 second too long. Jared carried boxes and didn't apologize again for the shot he took. Tyler promised to visit on weekends. The way nephews do when they've learned promises can be heavier than they sound. Karen looked at her daughter and saw the outline of the girl who'd taped a picture to a truck, and the woman who had learned to tape a story to a city until it stuck. Before she left, Nora drove to Bellwood one more time. The water was down to its workman color, cranes craning, silt baking into future paths. She parked, rolled down the window, and played the tape of Mark singing to a child so small she couldn't keep the harmonies. The sound wasn't good. The sound was perfect. She said thank you out loud. To him. To whoever had taught him to write things down. To the clerk who kept a receipt too ordinary to notice. To the part of herself that stayed with a question even when the answers arrived with threats. Then she turned off the engine and started toward a life that wouldn't feel like a waiting room. What stayed with her wasn't vengeance. It was this: the truth is patient, but it also asks for help. Keep a copy. Tell someone you trust. And when the choice is between looking away and looking closer, remember that silence solves nothing, and attention, persistent, ordinary attention, can sometimes pull a body back into the light.